Hi, y'all. Okay, so this is pretty exciting. I knew this guy was a freaking Nazi, and I think it's very interesting. I found a lot of information here with this article, and it's very interesting, right? Because it just shows you how this world is going, right? And how people think there was a difference between like Hitler and what rules this earth, right? Like these leaders are put on by the same group of people, the same synagogue of Satan. And it reminds me, right, of the Bible verse, Revelation 2:9, that a lot of people don't seem to understand. And it says, I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich, and I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. And that's what rules us, is these people, right? It doesn't matter what physical form they're in. They can be Chinese, Japanese, Chuck E. Cheese, freaking they can call themselves Jews like George Soros does. They can call Lord Rothschild, they can call themselves whatever they want to. The Bushes and the Clintons, they call themselves Christians, right? But they're the same synagogue of Satan. Anyway, so let's learn here about Klaus Schwab, family values. Is the real Klaus Schwab a kindly old uncle figure wishing to do good for humanity, or is he really the son of a Nazi collaborator who used slave labor and aided Nazi efforts to obtain the first atomic bomb? Johnny Vedmore investigates. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, Klaus Schwab sat having breakfast in the Park East Synagogue in New York City with Rabbi Arthur Schneier, former vice president of the World Jewish Congress and close associate of the Bronfman and Lauder families. Yeah, like Estee Lauder. Together, the two men watched one of the most impactful events of the next 20 years unfold as planes struck the World Trade Center buildings. Now, 2 decades on, Klaus Schwab again sits in a front row seat of yet another generation-defining moment in modern human history. Always seeming to have a front row seat when tragedy approaches, Schwab's proximity to world-altering events likely owes to his being one of the most well-connected men on earth. As the driving force behind the World Economic Forum, he actually invented it, y'all. He founded it in like 1979. The International Organization for Public-Private Cooperation. Schwab has courted heads of state, leading business executives, and the elite of academic and scientific circles into the Davos fold for over 50 years. More recently, he also courted the ire of many due to his more recent role as the frontman of the Great Reset, a sweeping effort to make civilization globally for the express benefit of the elite of the World Economic Forum and their allies. Schwab, during his forum's annual meeting in January 2021, stressed that the building of trust would be integral to the success of the Great Reset, signaling a subsequent expansion of the initiative's already massive public relations campaign. Though Schwab called for the building of trust through unspecified progress, trust is normally facilitated through transparency. Perhaps that is why so many have declined to trust Mr. Schwab and his motives, as so little is known about the man's history and background prior to his founding of the World Economic Forum in the early 1970s. So like before, I actually looked up Klaus Schwab. This is like last year, I was looking him up, and all you could find was like a blurb about his father working in Switzerland and that he crossed the border from Ravensburg, Germany, into Switzerland every day during World War II. And how I knew he was a Nazi is who was allowed to travel at that time? Nazis, certainly not Jews, right? All right. Like many prominent frontmen for elite-sponsored agendas, the online record of Schwab has been well sanitized, making it difficult to come across information on his early history as well as information on his family. Yet, having been born in Ravensburg, Germany in 1938, many have speculated in recent months that Schwab's family may have had some tie to Axis war efforts, ties that, if exposed, could threaten the reputation of the World Economic Forum and bring unwanted scrutiny to its professed missions and motives. See, that's the thing, right? So you see these people who are supposedly Jews, yet they're funding Hitler and supporting the Axis. The same thing happened with Prescott Bush, right? He actually had his assets seized by the U.S. Congress for his role in giving Hitler steel through Thyssen Steel. He was on the board of Thyssen Steel, and the U.S. Congress actually seized his assets over it. So that's what we're working against, right? Like these people, the elite, are all on Team Elite. All right. In this unlimited hangout investigation, the past that Klaus Schwab has worked to hide is explored in detail, revealing the involvement of the Schwab family not only in the Nazi quest for an atomic bomb, but apartheid South Africa's illegal nuclear program. Especially revealing is the history of Klaus's father, Eugene Schwab, who led the Nazi-supported German branch of a Swiss engineering firm into the war as a prominent military contractor. That company, Escher Weiss, would use slave labor to produce machinery critical to the Nazi war effort, as well as the Nazis' effort to produce heavy water for its nuclear program. Years later, at the same company, a young Klaus Schwab served on the board of directors when the decision was made to furnish the racist apartheid regime of South Africa with the necessary equipment to further its quest to become a nuclear power. See how this works? Now, also, in these camps that Hitler had, they were making motors for Ford Motors, and JP Morgan was financing it all. And if you read a book, there's a book called House of Morgan, and it's freaking, I don't know, it's like 4 inches thick and kind of boring, but it tells you a lot about what went on and what these monsters were doing. With the World Economic Forum now a prominent advocate for nuclear non-proliferation and clean nuclear injury, Klaus Schwab's past makes him a poor spokesperson for his professed agenda for the present and the future. Yet digging even deeper into his activities, it becomes clear that Schwab's real role has long been to shape global, regional, and industry agendas of the present in order to ensure the continuity of larger, much older agendas that came into disrepute after World War II, not just nuclear technology, but also eugenics-influenced population control policies. These people never go away with their eugenics, okay? Bill Gates, his father, was the guy that founded the Eugenics Society in America, and, he basically worked with Planned Parenthood because the Eugenics Society became Planned Parenthood. A Schwabian story. Or a Swabian story, right? Because they're swabbing the deck and trying to get rid of all this knowledge, right? Okay. On 10 July 1870, Klaus Schwab's grandfather, Jakob Wilhelm Gottfried Schwab, referred to simply as Gottfried, was born in a Germany at war with its French neighbors. Karlsruhe, the town where Gottfried Schwab was born, was located in the Grand Duchy of Baden, ruled in 1870 by the 43-year-old Grand Duke of Baden, Frederick I. The following year, the aforementioned Duke would be present at the proclamation of the German Empire, which took place in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Yeah, like when I went to the Hall of Mirrors, when I went to Versailles, when I walked up, I knew why they wanted to chop off all the royals' heads, because it was just, it was so ridiculous how much, expense was spent there to build that place. He was the only son-in-law of the incumbent Emperor Wilhelm I, and as Frederick I was one of the reigning sovereigns of Germany. By the time Gottfried Schwab turned 18 years old, Germany would see Wilhelm II take the throne upon the death of his father, Frederick III. In 1893, a 23-year-old Gottfried Schwab would officially depart from Germany, giving up his German citizenship and leaving Karlsruhe in order to emigrate to Switzerland. At the time, his occupation was noted as being that of a simple baker. Here, Gottfried would meet Marie Lapierre, who was from Kirchberg in Bern, Switzerland, who was 5 years his junior. They would marry in Roggwil, Bern, in 27 May 1898, and the following year, on 27 April 1899, their child, Eugene Schwab, was born. At the time of his birth, Gottfried Schwab had moved up in the world, having become a machine engineer. So he was obviously lying, saying he was a baker, right? Because he became an engineer in a year? Okay. When Eugene was around 1 year old, Gottfried and Marie Schwab decided to return to live in Karlsruhe, and Gottfried reapplied for German citizenship again. Eugene Schwab would follow in the footsteps of his father and also became a machine engineer, and in the future years, he would advise his children to do the same. Eugene Schwab would eventually begin working at a factory in a town in Upper Swabia, in southern, interesting. So it's without a CH. So Sva and Schwa. Schwab for Klaus Schwab and Sva for this place in southern Germany. Capital of the district of Ravensburg, Baden-Württemberg. The factory where he would forge his career was the German branch of a Swiss company named Escher Weiss. Switzerland had a very long-standing economic ties to the Ravensburg area, and Swiss traders in the early 19th century bringing in yarn and weaving products. In the same period, Ravensburg delivered grain to Rorschach in 1870 alongside breeding animals and various cheeses deep within the Swiss Alps. Between 1809 and 1837, there were 375 Swiss people living in Ravensburg, though the Swiss population had dropped to 133 by 1910. In the 1830s, skilled Swiss workers would set up a cotton factory with an incorporated bleaching and finishing plant owned and maintained by the Erpf brothers. The Ravensburg horse market, created in around 1840, also attracted many people from Switzerland, especially after the 1847 opening of the railway line from Ravensburg to Friedrichshafen, a town situated on a nearby Lake Constance on the borders of Switzerland and Germany. Rorschach grain traders would make regular visits to the Ravensburger Kornhaus, and eventually this cross-border cooperation and trade also led to a branch in the Zurich machine factory, Escher Weiss and CIE, opening in the city. This feat was made plausible once a train line connecting the Swiss to the German route network was completed between 1850 and 1853. The factory was set up by Walter Zuppinger between 1856 to 1859 and would begin production in 1860. In 1861, we can see the official patent of the manufacturers Escher Weiss in Ravensburg of peculiar facilities on mechanical looms for ribbon weaving. At this time, the Ravensburg branch of Escher Weiss would be directed by Walter Zuppinger, and where he would be developed his tangential turbine and where he gained a number of additional patents. In 1870, Zuppinger, along with others, would also founded a paper mill works in Bayernfurt, close to Ravensburg. He retired in 1875 and devoted all his energies to the further advance of turbines. And right here, this is the founding document of Escher Weiss Ravensburg factory dated in 1860. At the turn of the new century, Escher Weiss had put the ribbon weaving to one side and began to concentrate on much bigger products like the production of large industrial turbines, and in 1907 they sought an approval and concession procedure for the construction of a hydropower plant near Dogern am Rhein, which was reported in a Basel brochure from 1925. In 1920, Escher Weiss found themselves embroiled in serious financial difficulties. The Treaty of Versailles had restricted the military and economic growth of Germany following the Great War. Yeah, great for who? And the Swiss company found the downturn in neighboring national civil engineering projects too much to bear. The parent branch of Escher Weiss was located in Zurich and dated back to 1805, and the company, which still benefited from a good reputation and history lasting more than a century, was deemed too important to lose. In December 1920, a reorganization was carried out by writing down the share capital from 11.5 to 4.015 million French francs, and which was later increased by 5.515 million Swiss francs. By the end of the fiscal year of 1931, Escher Weiss was still losing money. Yet the Plunky Company continued to deliver large-scale civil engineering contracts through the 1920s, as noted in the official correspondence written in 1924 from Wilhelm III, Prince of Urach, to the company Escher Weiss and to the asset manager of the House of Urach, accountant Julius Heller. This document discusses the general terms and conditions of the Association of German Water Turbine Manufacturers for the delivery of machines and other equipment for hydropower plants. This is also confirmed in a brochure on the conditions of the Association of German Water Turbine Manufacturers for the installation of turbines and machine parts within the German Reich. Printed on March 20th, 1923, in an advertising brochure from Escher Weiss for a universal oil pressure regulator. After the Great Depression in the early 1930s, great, here we go, the use of that word again, right? who is it great for, had laid waste to the global economy, Escher Weiss announced that as the catastrophic development of the economic situation in connection with the currency declines, the company, Escher Weiss, is temporarily unable to continue its current liabilities in various customer countries. The company also revealed that they would apply for a court deferral to the Swiss newspaper Neue Zürcher Nachrichten, which reported on 1 December 1931 that the company Escher Weiss had been granted a stay of bankruptcy until the end of March 1932, and acting as curator in Switzerland, a trust company has been appointed. The article stated optimistically that there should be a prospect of continuing operations. In 1931, Escher Weiss employed around 1,300 non-contracted workers and 550 salaried employees. By the mid-1930s, Escher Weiss had again found itself in financial trouble. In order to rescue the company at this time, a consortium was brought on board to save the ailing engineering firm. The consortium was partly formed by the Federal Bank of Switzerland, which was coincidentally headed by Max Schwab, who is of no relation to Klaus Schwab. Okay, sure. And further restructuring took place. In 1938, it was announced that an engineer at the firm, Colonel Jakob Schmidt-Heine, what a name, Schmidt-Heine, would become the new president of the board of directors at Escher Weiss. Sorry if any of your last names is that name. I didn't mean to make fun of you, but it is kind of funny sounding. Soon after the outbreak of war in 1939, Schmidt-Heine was quoted as saying, "The outbreak of war does not necessarily mean unemployment for the machine industry in a neutral country. On the contrary." Escher Weiss and its new management were apparently looking forward to profiting off of the war, paving the way for their transformation into a major Nazi military contractor. Interesting. A brief history of Jewish persecution in Ravensburg. When Adolf Hitler came to power, many things changed in Germany, and the story of the Jewish population of Ravensburg during that era is a sad one to tell. Yet it is hardly the first time that anti-Semitism had been first recorded as having reared its ugly head in the region. In the Middle Ages, a synagogue, mentioned as far back as 1345, was located in the center of Ravensburg, serving a small Jewish community which can be traced from 1330 to 1429. At the end of 1429 and through 1430, the Jews of Ravensburg were targeted and a horrific massacre ensued. In the nearby settlements of Lindau, Überlingen, Buchhorn, later renamed Friedrichshafen, Meersburg, and Konstanz, there were mass arrests of Jewish residents. The Jews of Lindau were burnt alive. During the 1429 to 1430 Ravensburg blood libel, in which members of the Jewish community were accused of ritually sacrificing babies. Yeah, well, the people who were doing that were probably the same people we're talking about. The ones that didn't get killed, right? The Klaus Schwabs of the world. In August 1430 in Überlingen, the Jewish community was forced to convert. 11 of them did so, and 12 who refused were killed. The massacres, which took place in Lindau, Überlingen, and Ravensburg, happened with the direct approval of the ruling king Sigmund, and any remaining Jews were expelled from the region. Ravensburg had this ban confirmed by Emperor Ferdinand I in 1559, and it was upheld, for example, in an 1804 instruction issued for the city guard, which read, "Since the Jews are not allowed to engage in any trade or business here, no one else is allowed to enter the city by post or carriage. The rest, however, if they have not received a permit for a longer or shorter stay from the police office, are to be removed from the city by the police station." Not until the 19th century were Jews able to legally settle in Ravensburg again, and even by then, their number remained so small that a synagogue was not rebuilt. In 1858, there were only 3 Jews recorded in Ravensburg. In 1895, this number peaked at 57. From the turn of the century until 1933, the number of Jews living in Ravensburg had steadily decreased until the community was only made up of 23 people. I haven't studied this whole blood libel stuff a lot, but it wouldn't surprise me that this is the ilk, the synagogue of Satan, committing these crimes and that being blamed on regular Jews. Same thing with, you have the Inquisition, 800 years of calling women and whoever else witches and heretics and burning them at the stake. And if you actually look into who persecuted everyone, it's the same old families and the same old demons. So anyways, let's keep going. By the start of the 1930s, there were 7 main Jewish families living in Ravensburg, including the Adler, Erlanger, Harburger, Hermann, Landauer, Rose, and Sondermann families. After the National Socialists seized power, some of the Ravensburg Jews were initially forced to emigrate, while others would later be murdered in Nazi concentration camps. So the ones that were murdered obviously aren't of the Synagogue of Satan, in my opinion. Leading up to World War II, there were many public displays of hatred towards the small community of Jews in and around Ravensburg. As early as March 13, 1933, about 3 weeks before the nationwide Nazi boycott of all Jewish shops in Germany, SA guards posted themselves in front of 2 of the 5 Jewish shops in Ravensburg and tried to prevent potential buyers from entering and putting up signs on one shop stating Wohlwert closed until Aryanization. Wohlwerts would soon become Aryanized and would be the only Jewish-owned shop to survive the Nazi pogrom. Interesting. How were they Aryanized, right? What does that even mean? The other owners of the 4 large Jewish department stores in Ravensburg, Knopf, Merker, Landauer, and Wallersteiner, were all forced to sell their properties to non-Jewish merchants between 1935 and 1938. During this period, many of the Ravensburg Jews were able to flee abroad before the worst of the National Socialist persecution began. While at least 8 died violently, it was reported that 3 Jewish citizens who lived in Ravensburg survived because of their quote-unquote Aryan spouses. Some of the Jews who were arrested in Ravensburg during Kristallnacht were forced to march through the streets of Baden-Baden under SS Guard supervision the following day and were later deported to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Oh, I've never heard of that one. Horrific Nazi crimes against humanity took place in Ravensburg. On 1 January 1934, the law for the prevention of hereditary diseases came into force in Nazi Germany, meaning people with diagnosed illnesses such as dementia, schizophrenia, epilepsy, hereditary deafness, and various other mental disorders could be legally forcibly sterilized. So this is what they did at first, right? They started killing people who had, physical illnesses, just like they're doing right now, right? Or what they're going to be doing. In the Ravensburg City Hospital, today called Heilig Geist Hospital, 4 sterilizations were carried out beginning in April of 1934. By 1936, sterilization was the most performed medical procedure in the municipal hospital. Yeah, and over here in America, the eugenicists were doing the same thing. In fact, we had laws on the books in like North Carolina, California, many states. People were being sterilized, forcibly sterilized here in America up until 1976. And they probably still do it today. We just don't hear about it. In the pre-war years of the 1930s leading up to the German annexation of Poland, Ravensburg's Escher Weiss factory, now managed directly by Klaus Schwab's father, Eugene Schwab, continued to be the biggest employer in Ravensburg. Not only was the factory a major employer in the town, but Hitler's own Nazi party awarded the Escher Weiss Ravensburg branch the title of the National Socialist Model Company, while Schwab was at the helm. The Nazis were potentially wooing the Swiss company for cooperation in the coming war, and their advances were eventually reciprocated. Escher Weiss, Ravensburg, and the war. Ravensburg was an anomaly in wartime Germany, as it was never targeted by any Allied airstrikes. What a coinkydink. The presence of the Red Cross and a rumored agreement with various companies, including Escher Weiss, saw the Allied forces publicly agree to not target southern German town. It was not classified as a significant military target throughout the war, and for that reason, the town still maintains many of its original features. However, much darker things were afoot in Ravensburg once the war began. Do you see how this is all planned, right? Why would the Allies not bomb a factory that's helping Hitler? Because at the top, they're all working together to kill regular people. Eugene Schwab continued to manage the National Socialist Model Company for Escher Weiss, and the Swiss company would aid the Nazi Wehrmacht produce significant weapons of the war as well as more basic armaments. The Escher Weiss company was a leader in large turbine technology for hydroelectric dams and power plants, but they also manufactured parts for German fighter planes. They were also intimately involved with much more sinister projects happening behind the scenes, which, if completed, could have changed the outcome of World War II. Well, nothing changed the outcome of World War II. Why? Because they already knew who they wanted to win. Nazi officials in front of the Ravensbrück town hall in 1938. Look at all these Nazis. Yet the Allies did not bomb them. Western military intelligence were already aware of Escher Weiss's complicity and collaboration with the Nazis. There are records available from Western military intelligence at the time, specifically Record Group 226 from the data compiled by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, which shows the Allied forces were aware of some of the Escher Weiss business dealings with the Nazis. Within RG 226, there are 3 specific mentions of Escher Weiss, including file number 47178, which reads, Escher Weiss of Switzerland is working on a large order for Germany. Flamethrowers are dispatched from Switzerland under the name Brennstoffbehälter, dated September 1944. File number 41589 showed that the Swiss were allowing German exports to be stored in their country, a supposedly neutral nation during World War II. The entry reads, business relations between Empresa Nacional Calvo Sotelo and Caso, Escher Weiss, and Mineral Zellbau Gesellschaft. See also L42627 report on collaboration between the Spanish Empresa Nacional Calvo Sotelo and the German Rheinmetall Borsig on German exports stored in Switzerland. File number 72654 claimed that Hungary's bauxite was formerly sent to Germany and Switzerland for refining. Then a government syndicate built an aluminum plant at Dunalmas on the borders of Hungary. Electric power was provided. Hungary contributed coal mines, and equipment was ordered from the Swiss firm Escher Weiss. Production began in 1941. Wow. Yet Escher Weiss were leaders in one blossoming field in particular, the creation of new turbine technology. The company had engineered a 14,500 horsepower turbine for the Norsk Hydro Industrial Facility's strategically important hydroelectric plant at Vemork, near Rjukan in Norway. The Norsk Hydro plant, partly powered by Escher Weiss, was the only industrial plant under Nazi control capable of producing heavy water, an ingredient essential for making plutonium for the Nazi atomic bomb program. The Germans had put all possible resources behind the production of heavy water, but the Allied forces were aware of the potentially game-changing tech advances by the increasingly desperate Nazis. During 1942 and 1943, the hydro plant was the target of a particularly successful British commando and Norwegian resistance raids. Although heavy water production continued, the Allied forces would drop more than 400 bombs on the plant, which barely affected the operations at the sprawling facility. How was that possible? I guess maybe they were underground? In 1944, German ships attempted to transport heavy water back to Germany, but the Norwegian resistance were able to sink the ship carrying the payload. With help from Escher Weiss, the Nazis were almost able to change the tires of the war and bring about an Axis victory. Back in the Escher Weiss factory in Ravensbrück, Eugene Schwab had been busy putting forced laborers to work at his model Nazi company. During the years of World War II, nearly 3,600 forced laborers worked in Ravensbrück, including at Escher Weiss. According to the city archivist in Ravensbrück, Andreas Schmuder, the Escher Weiss machine factory in Ravensbrück employed between 198 and 203 civil workers and POWs during the war. Karl Schweitzer, a local Lindau historian, states that Escher Weiss maintained a small special camp for forced laborers on the factory premises. So here's something. My mom, she stayed with a Austrian engineer, when she was in Vienna. And his name was Eddie Schida, and he was a famous mechanical engineer who was actually conscripted and forced to work for the Nazis. He was forced to work for them, basically upon pain of death. He had written a book about all of these different ways to power cars. Like he had a wood-burning car, a water-burning car, all of this stuff. And so she has told me some of the stories about this kind of thing. So it is true that people were forced to work, not just people who were like you think of like Jews and Poles and Slavs and everyone else, the mentally ill or whatever in the work camps, but people who were professionals, were kidnapped and forced to work. All right, here we go. The use of masses of forced labor in Ravensburg made it necessary to set up one of the largest recorded Nazi forced labor camps in the workshop of a former carpenter's at Siegelstrasse 16. At one time, the camp in question accommodated 125 French prisoners of war who were later distributed to other camps in 1942. The French workers were replaced by 150 Russian prisoners of war who, it was rumored, were treated the worst out of all the POWs. One such prisoner was Zina Zakusheva, whose work card and workbook are held by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Those documents identify her as a non-Jewish forced laborer assigned to Ravensburg, Germany during 1943 and 44. Eugene Schwab would dutifully maintain the status quo during the war years. After all, with young Klaus Martin Schwab having been born in 1938 and his brother Urs Rainer Schwab born a few years later, Eugene would have wanted to keep his children out of harm's way. Klaus Martin Schwab, the international man of mystery. Born on 30 March 1938 in Ravensburg, Germany, Klaus Schwab was the eldest child in a normal nuclear family. Well, that's normal, okay, sure. Between 1945 and 47, Klaus attended primary school in Au, Germany. Klaus Schwab recalls in a 2006 interview with the Irish Times that after the war, I chaired the Franco-German Regional Youth Association. My heroes were Adenauer, de Gasperi, and de Gaulle. Okay. Klaus Schwab and his younger brother, Urs Rainer Schwab, were both to follow in the footsteps of their grandfather, Gottfried, and their father, Eugene, and would both initially train as mechanical or machine engineers. Klaus's father had the young Schwab, if he wanted to make an impact on the world, he should train as a machine engineer. This would be only the beginning of Schwab's university credentials. Klaus would begin studying his plethora of degrees at Spon Gymnasium Ravensburg during 1949 and 1957, eventually graduating from the Humanistisches Gymnasium in Ravensburg. Between 1958 and 1962, Klaus began working with various engineering companies, and in 1962, Klaus completed his mechanical engineering studies at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich with an engineering diploma. The following year, he also completed an economics course at the University of Freiburg, Switzerland. From 1963 to 1966, Klaus worked as assistant to the director of the German Machine Building Association, VDMA, in Frankfurt. In 1965, Klaus was also working on his doctorate from the ETH Zurich, writing his dissertation on the long-term export credit as a business problem in mechanical engineering. Then in 1966, he received his doctorate in engineering from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. At this time, Klaus Schwab, or Eugene Schwab, was swimming in bigger circles than he had previously swum. After being a well-known personality in Ravensburg as the managing director of the Escherweiss factory from before the war, Eugene would eventually be elected as the president of the Ravensburg Chamber of Commerce. In 1966, during the founding of the German Committee for Splügen Railway Tunnel, Eugene Schwab defined the founding of the German Committee as a project that creates a better and faster connection for large circles in our increasingly converging Europe, and thus new opportunities for cultural, economic, and social development. In 1967, Klaus Schwab gained a doctorate in economics from the University of Freiburg, Switzerland, as well as a Master of Public Administration qualification from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard in the United States. While at Harvard, Schwab was taught by Henry Kissinger, who he would later say were among his top 3 figures who had most influenced his thinking over the course of his entire life. So here you go. You got Henry Kissinger and his former pupil Klaus Schwab welcomed former UK Prime Minister Ted Heath at the 1980 World Economic Forum's annual meeting. In the previously mentioned Irish Times article of 2006, Klaus talks about that period as being very important to the formation of his present ideological thinking, stating, "Years later, when I came back to the U.S. after my studies at Harvard, there were 2 events that had a decisive triggering event on me. The first was a book by Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, the American Challenge, which said Europe would lose out against the US because of Europe's inferior management methods. The other event was, and this is relevant to Ireland, the Europe of the Six became the Europe of the Nine. Once again, we got their coding, right? Number coding. These two events would help shape Klaus Schwab into the man who wanted to change the way people went about their business. Yeah, evil Nazi. That same year, Klaus's younger brother, Urs Rainer Schwab, graduated from ETH Zurich as a mechanical engineer, and Klaus Schwab went to work for his father's old company, Escher Weiss, soon to become Sulzer Escher Weiss AG Zurich, as assistant to the chairman to aid in the reorganization of merging companies. This leads us toward Klaus's nuclear connections. And look at this, like he just goes and starts work after college and he's like assistant to the chairman, you know. They just waltz right in, right? The rise of a technocrat. Sulzer, a Swiss company whose origins date back to 1834, had first risen to prominence after starting to build compressors in 1906. By 1914, the family-run firm had become part of the three joint stock companies, one of which was the official holding company. In the 1930s, Sulzer's profits would suffer during the Great Depression, and like many businesses at the time, faced disruption in industrial actions from their workers. World War II may not have affected Switzerland as much as her neighbors, but the economic boom that was to follow led Sulzer growing in power and market dominance. In 1966, just before the arrival of Klaus Schwab at Escher Weiss, the Swiss turbine manufacturers signed a cooperation agreement with the Sulzer brothers in Winterthur. Sulzer and Escher Weiss would begin to merge in 1966 when Sulzer purchased 53% of the company's shares. Escher Weiss would officially become Sulzer Escher Weiss AG in 1969 when the last of the shares were acquired by the Sulzer brothers. Once the merger had started, Escher Weiss would begin to be restructured, and two of the existing board members would be the first to find their service to Escher Weiss coming to an end. Dr. H. Schindler and W. Stoffel would resign from the board of directors, now headed by George Sulzer and Alfred Schaffner. Dr. Schindler had been a member of the Escher Weiss board of directors for 28 years and had worked alongside Eugene Schwab throughout much of his service. Peter Schmidt-Heine would later take over as chairman of the board of directors of Escher Weiss, continuing the Schmidt-Heine family rule over the company's executives. During the restructuring process, it was decided that Escher Weiss and Sulzer would concentrate on separate areas of machine engineering, with Escher Weiss factories primarily working on the hydraulic power plant construction, including turbines, storage pumps, reversing machines, closing devices and pipelines, as well as steam turbines, turbo compressors, evaporation systems, centrifuges, and machines for the paper and pulp industry. Sulzer would concentrate on the refrigeration industry as well as the steam boiler construction and gas turbines. Do you how these corporations, you see how they own everything? They have just look at this one little company, right? And their mergers. What big part of the economy they're involved in. On 1 January 1968, the freshly reorganized Sulzer Escher Weiss was rolled out publicly, and the company had become a streamline, a move deemed necessary because of several large acquisitions. This included a close collaboration with Brown Boveri, a group of Swiss electrical engineering companies who had also worked for the Nazis, supplying the Germans with some of their U-boat technology used during World War II. Brown Boveri was also described as defense-related electrical contractors and would find the conditions of the cold arms race to be beneficial for their business. I wonder if this is the same Brown as Brown and Root. The merger and reorganization of these Swiss mechanical engineering giants saw their collaboration pay off in unique ways. During the 1968 Winter Olympics in Grenoble, Sulzer and Escher Weiss used 8 refrigeration compressors to create tons of artificial ice. In 1969, two firms combined to help in the building of the new passenger ship Hamburg, the first ship in the world to be fully air-conditioned thanks to the Sulzer-Escher Weiss combination. In 1967, Klaus Schwab officially burst onto the scene of the Swiss business community and took a lead in the merger between Sulzer and Escher Weiss, as well as forming profitable alliances with Brown Boveri and others. In December 1967, Klaus would speak at Zurich event to the top Swiss machine engineering organizations, the Employers Association of Swiss Machine and Metal Manufacturers and the Association of Swiss Machine Manufacturers. In his talk, he would correctly predict the importance of incorporating computers into modern Swiss machine engineering, stating that in 1971, products that are not even on the market today are likely to account for up to a quarter of sales. This requires companies to systematically research possible developments and to identify gaps in the market. Today, 18 of the 20 largest companies in our machine industry have planning departments that are entrusted with such tasks. Of course, everyone has to make use of the latest technological advances, and the computer is one of them. The many small and medium-sized companies in our machine industry take the path of cooperation or use the services of special data processing service providers. Computers and data were seen as important to the future, according to Schwab, and this was further projected in the reorganization of Sulzer Escher Weiss during their merger. Sulzer's modern website reflects this noteworthy change in direction, stating in 1968, material technology activities are intensified by Sulzer and form the basis for medical technology products. The fundamental change from a machine-building company to a technology corporation starts to become apparent. Klaus Schwab was helping to turn Sulzer Escher Weiss into something more than just a machine-building giant. He was transforming them into a technology corporation driving at high speed into a high-tech future. It should be noted that Sulzer Escher Weiss changed another focus of their business to help them form the basis of medical technology products, an area not previously mentioned as target industry for Sulzer or Escher Weiss. But technological advancement wasn't the only upgrade Klaus Schwab wanted to introduce at Sulzer Escher Weiss. He also wanted to change how the company thought about their business managerial style. Schwab and his close associates were pushing an entirely new business philosophy which would allow all employees to accept the imperatives of motivation and to ensure at home a sense of flexibility and maneuverability. It is here in the late 1960s where we see Klaus begin to emerge as a more public figure. At this time, Sulzer Escher Weiss company also became more interested in engaging with the press than ever before. In January 1969, the Swiss giant set up a public advisory session entitled Press Day of the Machine Industry, which mainly concerned questions on company management. During the event, Schwab would state that using authoritarian styles of business management are unable to fully activate the quote-unquote human capital, an argument he would use on many separate occasions during the late 1960s. Plutonium in Pretoria. Escher Weiss were pioneers in some of the most important tech in power generation. As the U.S. Department of Energy points out in their paper on supercritical CO2 Brayton cycle development, CBC, a device used in hydro and nuclear power plants, Escher Weiss was the first company known to develop the turbo machineries for CBC systems starting in 1939, going on to state that 24 systems were built. With Escher Weiss designing the power conversion cycles and building the turbo machinery for all but 3. By 1966, just before the entrance of Schwab into the Escher Weiss and to the start of the Sulzer merger, the Escher Weiss helium compressor was designed for the Lafleur Corporation and continued the evolution of the Brayton cycle development. This technology was still of importance to the arms industry by 1986, with nuclear-powered drones being equipped with a helium-cooled Brayton cycle nuclear reactor. So they had nuclear-powered drones in 86? Wow. Escher Weiss had been involved with manufacturing and installing nuclear technology at least as early as 1962, as is shown by this patent for a heat exchange arrangement for a nuclear power plant, and this patent from 1966 for a nuclear reactor gas turbine plant with emergency cooling. After Klaus left Sulzer Escher Weiss, Sulzer would also help to develop special turbocompressors for uranium enrichment to yield reactor fuels. When Klaus Schwab joined Sulzer Escher Weiss in 1967 and started the reorganization of the company to be a tech company, the involvement of Sulzer Escher Weiss in the darker aspects of the global nuclear arms race became immediately more pronounced. Before Klaus became involved, Escher Weiss had often concentrated on helping design and build parts for civilian uses of nuclear technology, e.g. nuclear power generation. Yet with the arrival of the eager Mr. Schwab, also came the company's participation in the illegal proliferation of nuclear weapons technology. By 1969, the incorporation of Escher Weiss into Sulzer was fully completed, and they would be rebranded into Sulzer AG, dropping the historical Escher Weiss from their name. Yeah, probably, because everybody knew they were Nazis. It was eventually revealed, thanks to the review and report that came out by Swiss authorities, that a man named Peter Hug, a Sulzer Escher Weiss, began secretly procuring and building key parts for nuclear weapons during the 1960s. The company, while Schwab was on board, also began to play a critical role in the development of South Africa's illegal nuclear weapons program during the darkest years of the apartheid regime. Klaus Schwab was a leading figure in the founding of a company culture which helped Pretoria build 6 nuclear weapons and partially assemble a 7th. In the report, Peter Hug outlined how Sulzer Escher Weiss AG, referred to as post-merger as just Sulzer AG, had supplied vital components to the South African government and found evidence of Germany's role in supporting the racist regime, also revealing that the Swiss government was aware of illegal deals but tolerated them in silence while supporting some of them actively or criticized them only half-heartedly. Hug's report was eventually finalized in the work entitled Switzerland and South Africa 1948-94, final report of the NFP 42+, commissioned by the Swiss Federal Council, which was compiled and written by George Kreis and published in 2007. In 1967, South Africa had constructed a reactor as part of a plan to produce plutonium. The Safari 2, located at Pelindaba. Safari 2 was a part of a project to develop a reactor moderated by heavy water, which would be fueled by natural uranium and cooled using sodium. This link to developing heavy water for the creation of uranium, and the same technology which had been utilized by the Nazis, also with the help of Escher Weiss, may explain why South Africans initially got Escher Weiss involved. But by 1969, South Africa abandoned the heavy water reactor project at Pelindaba because it was draining resources from the uranium enrichment program that had first begun in 1967. So here's a picture of a South African nuke in storage. In 1970, Escher Weiss were definitely deeply involved with nuclear technology, as seen in a record available in the Landesarchives Baden-Württemberg. The record shows details of a public procurement process and contains information about award talks with specific companies involved in the procurement of nuclear technology and materials. The companies cited include Nucom, Ude, Kranz, Preusag, Escher Weiss, Siemens, Rheintal, Leibold, Lurgi, and the famous Transnuclear. Wow. All over. Heck, we work with Siemens. I work with Siemens right now on my job. The Swiss and South Africans had a close relationship through the period of this history when it was hardly easy for brutal South African regime to find close allies. By 4 November 1977, the United Nations Security Council had enacted Resolution 418, which imposed a mandatory arms embargo against South Africa, an embargo that wouldn't be fully lifted until 1994. George Kreis pointed out the following in his detailed assessment of the Hugh report. The fact that the authorities assumed a laissez-faire attitude even after May 1978 comes to the fore in exchange of letters between the anti-apartheid movement and the DFMA in October-December 1978. As the study by Hugh explicates, the anti-apartheid movement of Switzerland pointed to German reports according to which Sulzer Escher Weiss and a company called BBC had supplied parts for the South African uranium enrichment plant, and to repeated credits to Eskom, which also included considerable contributions by Swiss banks. These assertions led to questions of whether the Federal Council, in light of the fundamental support of the UN embargo, ought not to instigate the National Bank to stop authorizing credits for Eskom in the future. Swiss banks would help to fund the South African race to nukes, and by 1986, Sulzer Escher Weiss were successfully producing special compressors for uranium enrichment. The founding of the World Economic Forum. By 1970, the young upstart Klaus Schwab wrote to the European Commission and asked for help in setting up a non-commercial think tank for European business leaders. The European Commission would sponsor the event as well, sending French politician Raymond Barre to act as the forum's intellectual mentor, Raymond Barre, who was at the time European Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, would later to go on to become French Prime Minister, and would be accused of making anti-Semitic comments while in office. Do you see all this bullshit? I mean, so this guy writes a letter to the European Commission and automatically they send their future prime minister to help him. Doesn't it just show you how none of this is real? Right? It's just so, everything is so well planned out and these people all know each other. So in 1970, Schwab left Escheweiss to organize a 2-week business managerial conference. In 1971, the first meeting of the World Economic Forum, then called the European Management Symposium, convened in Davos, Switzerland. Around 450 participants from 31 countries would take part in Schwab's first European Management Symposium, mostly made up of managers from various European companies, politicians, and U.S. academics. The project was recorded as organized by Klaus and his Hillary Hilda Stoll, who later the same year would become Klaus Schwab's wife. Yeah, and if you haven't checked out my video where I looked at Klaus's wife, look at that jaw on that supposed woman. Klaus's European Symposium was not an original idea. As writer Ganga J. Aratnam stated quite coherently in 2018, Klaus Schwab's spirit of Davos was also the spirit of Harvard. Not only had the business school advocated the idea of a symposium, prominent Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith championed the affluent society as well as the capitalism's planning needs and the rapprochement of East and West. It was also true that, as Aratnam had pointed out, this was not the first time Davos had hosted such events. Between 1928 and 31, the Davos University conferences took place at the Hotel Belvedere, events which were co-founded by Albert Einstein and were only halted by the Great Depression and the threat of looming war. The Club of Rome and the World Economic Forum. The most influential group that spurred the creation of Klaus Schwab's symposium was the Club of Rome, an influential think tank of the scientific and moneyed elite that mirrors the World Economic Forum in many ways, including in its promotion of global governance modeled by a technocratic elite. The club had been founded in 1968 by Italian industrialist Aurelio Pecci and Scottish chemist Alexander King during a private meeting at a residence owned by the Rockefeller family in Bellagio, Italy. Among its first accomplishments was a 1972 book entitled The Limits to Growth that largely focused on global overpopulation, warning that if the world's consumption patterns and population growth continued at the same high rates of time, the Earth would strike its limits within a century. At the third meeting of the World Economic Forum in 1973, Pecci delivered a speech summarizing the book, which the World Economic Forum website remembers as having been the distinguishing event of this historical meeting. That same year, the Club of Rome would publish a report detailing an adaptive model for global governments that would divide the world into 10 later interconnected economic political regions. The Club of Rome was long controversial for its obsession with reducing the global population and many of its earlier policies, which critics described as influenced by eugenics and neo-Malthusianism. However, the club's infamous 1991 book, The First Global Revolution, it was argued that such policies could gain popular support if the masses were able to link them with an existential fight against a common enemy. Well, what do you think that common enemy is now? The jibby jab. To that effect, the First Global Revolution contains a passage entitled The Common Enemy of Humanity is Man, which states the following: in searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat which must be confronted by everyone together. But in designating these dangers as the enemy, we fall into the trap which we have already warned readers about, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All of these dangers are caused by human intervention in natural processes, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy is humanity itself. And that's what they're doing, right? We're all dirty, sick, infectious people, right? We're all dirty humans, right? This is the whole shtick. This is what they do over and over again. In the years since, the elite that populate the Club of Rome and the World Economic Forum have frequently argued that population control methods are essential for protecting the environment. It is thus unsurprising that the World Economic Forum would similarly use the issue of climate and environment as a way to market otherwise unpopular policies such as those of the Great Reset as necessary. The past is prologue. Since the founding of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab has become one of the most powerful people in the world, and his Great Reset, who's it great for? I'll ask again, has made it more important than ever to scrutinize the man sitting on the globalist throne. Given his prominent role in the far-reaching effort to transform every aspect of the existing order, Klaus Schwab's history is difficult to research. When you start to dig into the history of a man like Schwab, who sits aloft other shadowy elite movers and shakers, you will soon find lots of information has been hidden or removed. Klaus is someone who wants to stay hidden in the shadowy corners of society and who will only allow the average person to see a well-presented construct of their chosen persona. Yeah, typical narcissistic demon. Is the real Klaus Schwab a kindly old uncle figure wishing to do good for humanity, or is he really the son of a Nazi collaborator who used slave labor and helped the Nazi efforts to obtain the first atomic bomb? Is Klaus the honest business manager who we should trust to create a fairer society and workplace for the common man, or is he the person who helped push Sulzer Weiss into a technological revolution that led to its role in the illegal creation of nuclear weapons for South Africa's racist apartheid regime? The evidence I have looked at does not suggest a kindly man, but rather a member of a wealthy, well-connected family that has a history of helping create weapons of mass destruction for aggressive racist governments. As Klaus Schwab said in 2006, knowledge will soon be available everywhere. I call it the Googleization of globalization. It's not that you know anymore, it's how you use it. You have to be a pace setter. Klaus considers himself to be a pace setter and a top table player, and it must be said that his qualifications and experience are impressive. Yet when it comes to practicing what you preach, Klaus has been found out. One of the three biggest challenges for the priority list of the World Economic Forum is the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Yet neither Klaus Schwab nor his father Eugene lived up to those same principles when they were in business. Quite the opposite. Yeah, because these people are inverted, and everything they do is an inversion of the natural order and opposite of what they say they're doing. In January, Klaus Schwab announced that 2021 is the year that the World Economic Forum and its allies must rebuild trust with the masses. However, if Schwab continues to hide his history and that of his father's connections to the nationalist social model company that was Weiss during the 1930s and 1940s, then people will have a good reason to distrust the underlying motivation of his overreaching, undemocratic Great Reset agenda. In the case of the Schwabs, the evidence doesn't point at simply poor business practices or some sort of misunderstanding. The history of the Schwab family instead reveals a habit of working with genocidal dictators for the base motives of profit and power. The Nazis and the South African apartheid regime are two of the worst examples of leadership in modern politics, yet the Schwabs obviously couldn't or wouldn't see that at the time. Yeah, well, they're establishing medical apartheid right now. They have no problem with apartheid because it's us little guys, the peasants, against them, those who consider themselves to be elites. In the case of Klaus Schwab himself, it appears that he has helped to launder relics of the Nazi era, i.e. its nuclear ambitions and its population control ambitions, so as to ensure the continuity of a deeper agenda. While serving in a leadership capacity at Sulzer Weiss, the company sought to aid the nuclear ambitions of the South African regime, then the most Nazi-adjacent government in the world, preserving Weiss's own Nazi-era legacy. Then, through World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab has helped to rehabilitate eugenics-influenced population control policies during the post-World War II era, a time when the revelations of Nazi atrocities quickly brought the pseudoscience into great disrepute. Is there any reason to believe that Klaus Schwab, as he exists today, has changed in any way? Or is he still the public face of a decades-long effort to ensure the survival of a very old agenda? The last question that should be asked about the real motivations behind the actions of Herr Schwab may be the most important for the future of humanity. Is Klaus Schwab trying to create the fourth industrial revolution, or is he trying to create the Fourth Reich? Man, that's a good article. All right, y'all. Have a good day.